we're going to continue with Dr. Elodie F and Dr. Alan McElligott. They will be talking about making goat welfare impactful. So please go ahead. I think Elodie is starting.
I'll mute myself. Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah, we'll start speaking and then Alan is following up. Yeah, so I think that was an excellent introduction to a talk, actually, what Libby was talking about, because what we had in mind with Alan was to mention a bit some of the research we've done on goats in the past on emotions and cognition, and how we actually managed to quite successfully force some of them to get good media attention. That's a very good skill of Alan, actually. And hence to communicate our findings to the public, because of course, if we don't do that, then it will just remain within the crowd of scientists and not be accessed by the public. So we'll start with mentioning a few studies we've done, and then I will pass on to Alan, who will mention a bit about how we managed to get this media attention. But let's start with why did we start studying goats? Was it important? Well, it's a widely used livestock with more than 1 billion globally, mainly located in Asia and Africa. And actually, when we started working on them a bit more than 10 years ago, there was actually very little done on their emotions and cognition in terms of research. And most of the welfare guidelines were actually based on knowledge of behavior of sheep. So luckily, this has changed now. But there was very little done at the beginning. So I'm going to mention now 3 studies that we've done that actually got good coverage. The first one was looking at cognitive biases. So basically, we were interested in measuring long-term states, long-term affective states, which are called mood. And as we know from human research, mood influences cognitive processes. So they affect what we pay attention to, what we learn, memorize, and the decision we make. So these are called cognitive biases. This affects, and the way we can do that is through judgment bias tests. That would be the equivalent of asking someone if they think this glass is half empty or half full. What we know from human research that people who are more pessimistic, so in a negative mood, will judge it as more half empty, while those in more optimistic or positive mood will judge it as half full. So in animals, this kind of test has been used quite a lot now. And then in goats, what we did was to build this giant maze with 5 arms where we trained them to find food in a bucket at the end of a corridor and no food on the other side. And they learned that extremely quickly. After 3 days, they already went very fast to the positive side and slowly to the negative one. And then we'll show them these ambiguous ways where they don't know what to expect and see what's the latency to approach the bucket. And we were really interested in comparing 2 groups of goats. So we're working in a goat sanctuary, rescuing goats either from some very poor welfare condition, like this goat here that was found tethered behind a fuel station, or from simply because the owner couldn't take care of the animal anymore, but there was no previous known violation. And our idea was that very likely the poor welfare goats would be more pessimistic. So we were then quite surprised by the results, which I'm going to briefly describe now. So we found what was expected in terms of latency. So that's the latency to approach the buckets. They were very fast at the positive side, much slower at the negative side, something in between for the ambiguous locations, but we have difference between males and females. For males, there was no difference between the 2 groups, while for females, what we found is that actually the poor welfare females were more optimistic and going much faster to the ambiguous location. So we had a small sample size, but this might actually indicate that goats rescued from poor condition that have been in a sanctuary for at least 2 years at the time of our research kind of recovered and became more optimistic than the others. And then the second study that we did, which was also quite impactful, also for scientists, I think, was kind of to develop methods to assess emotions, so short-term states now in goats, using the 2-dimensional framework, which is considering emotions based on whether they're positive or negative and how intense they are. So we place them in different situations, positive situation where they see us coming with food, and 2 negative situations where we give food to only one of them and not the other, and where we isolate them very shortly. And then we measure the heart rates to get an idea of the arousal, so the intensity of the emotion, and also the behavior, which kind of allowed us to say, verify the arousal and valence for 2 situations. And then we were mostly interested in vocalization, so that's what we analyzed in more details to see what's the, if we can find vocal indicators of arousal and valence. And I'm jumping into what we found. So with arousal, so when the heart rate indicated by the heart rate, so when the heart rate increases, they move more, they do more head movements, they have more ears forward, less ears on the side, and they call more. And with the valence, when they're in positive state, they have less ear back and more tail up. And in terms of vocalizations, this is what a goat in a negative state sounds like. And that's the same goat in a positive state. So maybe you can hear even yourself the difference and see also what the image of the sound looks like. It's basically much more shaky in the negative state. So we found the main difference was that they have a more stable pitch during positive situations. And then the last study I wanted to mention before we switch to Alan. So we also worked a bit on their cognition. So goat at the sanctuary, we noticed that they can manipulate lots of things. They can escape from their pen. I think goats are quite known for that. They can open locks. And so we were interested to scientifically test what they're able to do. So we trained them to operate that box. So they had to pull the lever out and then lift it up, which was a two-stage process to get some food. Which was quite complicated, but 9 goats out of 12 learned the task. We didn't find any evidence that they learned from each other, but we found evidence that they have a very long-term memory. So when we show them the box again after 10 months, and anecdotally after even 4 years, which was what the sanctuary did, they still remember very well. So that's what the task looked like. And then we'll move on to Alan. So that was the last learning trial, and then the goat can find food. And that's after 28 days. So I'm just gonna fast forward a bit. It takes them a bit of time to find where is the lever, but then they recall what to do. I think it's about here. And then she lifts it up. And then that's the last trial with 281 days. So here it takes her, there's always a bit of food here. So it takes them a bit of time to look around. And remember, but once they find the lever, then they quickly remember the task, and they were extremely motivated for that task. So I'm going to stop sharing, and then Alan will continue with his slides.
Okay, thanks a lot, Elodie. So before I go on to goats, I just want to make a couple of general points. Libby touched on this a couple of minutes ago, actually, as well. I'm sure all of this audience is familiar with the 5 freedoms. I just wanted to remind everybody that the 5 freedoms were formalized in 1979. So that means that the 5 freedoms are 45 years old. And so animal welfare research is about 45, 50 years old max. If you do a Scopus search for the term animal welfare, you will come up with over 54,000. Sorry. I'm not sure what happened. It won't take me long. We don't have too many slides. Keep my fingers off the buttons. Anyway, so if you do a Scopus search for animal welfare, you get over 54,000 hits. And of course, if you do a broader based Google Scholar search from 1979 to a couple of weeks ago, you get almost 4 million hits. So that means that there is a huge amount of animal welfare research going on, but it is our impression that there is only a trickle of animal welfare research progress. And essentially, that's the sort of problem that inspired this whole meeting and organizing this meeting. Now, we're not suggesting that every research paper should have direct impact, but we do think that there are problems and there is a slowdown. Sorry. My computer is suddenly jumping all over the place, probably because of my nervous state. Anyway, so yesterday we heard about the high welfare standards, or the advanced welfare standards of the EU. Well, I'm from Ireland, and Ireland is in the EU. And this was a big expose last year in relation to live exports, where young calves were being treated terribly. And even the basics of the 5 freedoms are still violated routinely across the world, and including in the EU and supposedly places with advanced welfare regulations. And I don't know if anyone's following the news, but even last week, there was a big expose about the mistreatment of horses at a slaughterhouse in Ireland as well. So this is a huge problem. So getting back to goats, how do we communicate to stakeholders about goats and goat welfare? Well, one of the key ways we do this is through issuing press releases. So press releases, we don't do a press release for every paper, we do press releases for a few papers. They're lay summaries of the key facts. They're prepared by the authors of the papers, as well as the press communication team of a respective university. This is one I did earlier in the year with Maria Mason. Goats can tell if you're happy or angry by your voice alone. So some of the websites that host these press releases are listed at the bottom. And either journalists just use the press releases and write about them, or they will contact the authors of the study and decide to do a more in-depth interview, and you end up with further media coverage. And the key point is to communicate the findings to the public, and especially farmers, for example, in the case of livestock. So as Elodie mentioned already, this is some of the key coverage we got over the years. She presented this already. This is a report that was in the BBC back in 2013, Happy Goats, How Animal Rehab Works, and thanks to Victoria Gill at the BBC for covering it. She went to Buttercup Sanctuary for Goats and did a film report with me. This is another example, Clever Problem Solvers, another one of Elodie's papers. I've put this up just to show you that when you do press communication, even if you don't speak German or Italian, it ends up getting reported in the press in other languages, not just English. And here we have German and Italian, as I said. Also important to mention, and Elodie mentioned at the start of the talk, that there are huge numbers of goats in India and China, and these are two press examples from those two countries. So it's really important to conveying the message internationally. We've also been lucky enough to be featured in a couple of TV documentaries resulting from this publicity. Bottom right, you've got Smart as a Goat, which came out in 2019, and on the top left, there's a documentary called Into Farm Animals' Minds, Very Clever Goats from 2021. And that Vimeo link, we'll post it in the chat later, but that is freely available and openly available for everyone else to view. So documenting evidence of impact, written evidence of impact can be challenging, but for example, this paper of ours that came out in 2018, top left, goats prefer positive human emotional facial expressions. And by 2020, this had featured in the Brooks livestock handling or compassionate livestock handling guidelines. So the text is small, it's featured in the bottom right. I can read it out to you, but they say, are written in the text here, goats generally prefer to interact with happy faces, meaning handlers should be aware of subtle emotional cues they may be giving out. So that came out in 2020 following a 2018 paper. We heard about Overton yesterday. This is one more example. So I did a search for my own name using Overton, and it came up with this hit, and it's from the European Food Safety Authority, and it's welfare guidelines or welfare of small ruminants during transport. And it cites two of our papers, one from 2014 and one from 2018. So it's getting a little bit easier to document and impact directly. So what are we trying to do? Well, overall, we're trying to raise awareness. We're trying to raise greater awareness of goat sentience more broadly, livestock sentience, even more broadly, animal sentience in general, and particularly the ability for these intelligent animals to actually suffer, with the hope that if people realize that they have the ability to suffer and they're sentient, they may be persuaded to either give them better lives or push for better lives for these sort of animals. And finally, some take-home messages. So the most important aspect of animal welfare research equals better lives for animals. I know that might sound silly, but I often go to meetings and conferences, and there's a lot of stuff presented about animal cognition or animal welfare research, and they forget about how this is going to get out to farmers or other stakeholders. Here we have press releases are one way to animal welfare improvement. I'm not suggesting it's the only way, and Libby touched on some examples earlier. Documenting impact is challenging, so we ask advocacy and other organizations to clearly cite the research that they are using when they're pushing for better animal welfare. On the other hand, we're also urging for greater public engagement by animal welfare researchers. And even if you want to be selfish about it, animal welfare can help career progression because universities across the world are really busy measuring their impact, and this is part of impact. But overall, I want to finish on a positive note, and that is, it's still important to recognize and celebrate slow incremental improvements in animal welfare. So even though at times it might be difficult, it's important to stay positive. And finally, just to thank our funders, and also thank the location of most of this research, which is Buttercup Sanctuary for Goats in the UK. And that is me, Don. Thank you for listening.
Thank you both for your presentation. We have time for one quick question. Was there a difference in how quickly whether the goats could learn the complex task depending on their background, poor welfare or not?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So we also checked that, of course, and it went a bit fast, so I didn't have time to explain everything. But in terms of the learning, the 3 days of learning, there was no difference at all. So they were both groups learn as fast in less than 3 days.
Thank you. There are some other questions on the chat that I'm sure Elodie and Alan can answer, and they have also shared some links that you can check. And I will pass it over to Becky so we can continue with the next talk.